I was never the type to cry in front of anyone, but that night I sat on my kitchen floor with an empty bank statement in my hands. 30 years of saving, every overtime shift, every holiday skipped, every quiet sacrifice I made to secure my daughter's college fund was gone. The account that once held our future had been drained to nothing. And him? He was gone too. No note, no explanation, just a short message on my phone that read, "I'm sorry. I had to find happiness." But happiness has a way of turning to dust when the truth finally catches up. Before I go any further, thank you for being here with me today. It means more than you know. I wonder where you're listening from right now. Maybe from a quiet kitchen like mine, or somewhere you go to think when the world feels heavy. This isn't just my story. It might be yours too. And if it is, I hope you'll find the courage to share it. Sometimes speaking the truth is the first step to taking back what was stolen. So if something like this has ever happened to you, tell me, because no one should ever have to carry that kind of hurt alone. I met him when I was in my 20s, back when life still felt wide open, and every choice seemed to hold a promise. He had a smile that could make you forget the time, and a way of talking about the future that made me believe we were building something solid together. We dreamed about a small house with a garden, Sunday dinners with laughter spilling out of the windows, and a life where we would stand by each other no matter what storms came our way. When our daughter was born, everything I did turned toward her future. We started a college fund almost as soon as we brought her home. Every extra dollar went there. I picked up shifts when I was tired, stayed late when I wanted to be anywhere else, and we learned to live without the little luxuries most people take for granted. Vacations became rare, new clothes were bought only when truly needed, and even birthday celebrations were kept modest because we had a goal, and I was determined we would reach it. She grew into a young girl who carried herself with a quiet strength, thoughtful in the way she noticed small details and never forgot a promise. I used to think she got that from him, though in time I realized she had built that strength herself. Looking back, there were small signs I should have paid more attention to, little habits of his that seemed harmless at the time. A second phone he said was for work, drawers he kept locked, even though we shared everything else, moments when he would step outside to take a call instead of speaking in front of me. I told myself every marriage has its boundaries, that privacy wasn't always a bad thing. But those boundaries were slowly becoming walls, and I didn't see how high they had grown, until it was too late. It started with a few strange bank notifications, small amounts moving in and out at odd times, nothing large enough to sound an alarm, but enough to make me pause. When I asked him about them, he brushed it off with a light laugh, saying the bank must have made a mistake or that it was some automatic payment I had forgotten about. I wanted to believe him, and for a while, I did. Then came the work trips, more frequent than ever before, each one lasting a little longer. Each one announced with less notice. He would return late at night, sometimes long after midnight, his clothes carrying a scent that wasn't his cologne, something softer, sweeter, unfamiliar. I told myself it could be from a hotel soap or a restaurant, but the thought didn't settle easily. One afternoon, a friend I'd known for years called me. Her voice was careful, hesitant, the way people sound when they're about to say something they wish they didn't have to. She said she'd been in town that day, near the small cafe on Main Street, and she thought she saw him. But he wasn't alone. I could hear the silence that followed her words, as if she was waiting for me to fill it with an explanation, but none came. My mind began turning over every little excuse he'd given, every time he'd walked into another room to take a call, every trip that didn't quite match the stories he told. Still, I clung to the belief that there had to be another reason, because to believe otherwise meant that the life I had built, the trust I had given, was standing on a crack that had been widening for years. And deep down, I think I already knew that once I looked too closely, I might not like what I saw. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where nothing in particular is supposed to happen, the kind you expect to unfold exactly like the one before it. I woke up before the alarm, as I always did, and reached across the bed out of habit. But his side was cold, not just from him slipping out early, but cold in a way that told me he hadn't been there for hours. At first, I thought he might have gone for one of his early runs, but then I noticed the silence in the house felt heavier than usual, like it was holding something back. When I opened the wardrobe to take out my clothes, there was a gap where his things should have been, hangers swinging slightly as though they had just been disturbed. A few shirts, his favorite jacket, even the old leather bag he'd had for years, all gone. I tried to steady myself, telling my hands not to shake as I walked to the kitchen to make coffee, hoping the motions would anchor me. That's when my phone buzzed with the first alert from the bank. It was for a withdrawal. Not large, but enough to notice. Then another, and another, each one pulling out more than the last. My breath caught as I opened the banking app and watched the numbers fall. Not slowly, not over days, but in quick, ruthless strikes until the balance read 0. I refreshed the screen over and over, as though the digits might magically reappear. But the account stayed empty, its purpose, our purpose, erased in minutes. And just when I thought the blow couldn't land any harder, I remembered the small emergency fund we kept tucked away. The one I had built quietly over the years for things we hoped would never happen. A medical bill, a broken roof, the kind of trouble you can't plan for but need to be ready for. I logged into that account with my heart pounding. And there it was, gone too. Every cent. My hands went cold as I stared at the screen, the weight of it pressing into me until I felt rooted to the chair. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. Deliberate and final. And the man I had trusted with my life had made it without me, walking out the door with more than just money. He had taken years of my work, my sacrifices, my faith, and left me with nothing but the sound of my own breathing in an empty house. I don't remember moving from the chair to the floor, only that one moment I was staring at the screen, and the next I was sitting on the cold tiles of the kitchen, my back against the cabinets, the phone still in my hand, as if letting go of it might make everything worse. The numbers weren't just numbers anymore. They were years of my life. I could see them as clearly as if they were playing out in front of me. The nights I stayed late at work while everyone else went home to their families. The weekends I took extra shifts instead of resting. The Christmas mornings where we kept things simple so more could go into the fund. The trips we never took because there was always a bigger goal. Every choice, every sacrifice had been for her, for the promise that when the time came, she would walk into her future without the weight of debt pressing her down. And now, all of it had been erased in the space of a morning. Not by bad luck, not by some twist of fate, but by the one person who was supposed to protect it as fiercely as I did. The weight of that truth pressed into me until my chest ached. I thought of the nights we'd sat together at this same table, talking about her future as if it was a shared dream. I thought of how I had believed him when he said we were a team, how I had trusted his promises without question. That trust was now lying in pieces around me, sharp enough to cut. The tears came then, hot and unsteady, blurring the edges of the kitchen until it felt like I was underwater. I wasn't just mourning the money, I was mourning the years it represented, the plans we had built together, and the belief that I could count on him no matter what. Anger began to creep in, slow and steady, threading itself through the heartbreak. It wasn't the kind of anger that made you shout or slam doors. It was quieter, heavier, the kind that sits deep in your bones and won't let you forget. He hadn't just stolen from me, he had stolen from her. He had taken the future I had fought to give her and handed it to someone else, leaving us to pick through the ruins. And as much as the betrayal burned, a part of me knew this was not the end of the story. Because there are some things you can lose without a fight, and there are some you cannot. And this was one I could not and would not let go. I was still on the kitchen floor when I heard the soft creak of the hallway floorboard, the one that always gave away when someone was coming. I didn't lift my head right away. I didn't want her to see my face, not like this. But she stepped into the room and stopped just a few feet from me, her eyes moving from my hands to the phone still glowing on the tiles beside me. She didn't look confused, she didn't even look surprised. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. And in a voice that was calm in a way I didn't expect, she asked, How much did he take? There was no hesitation in her question, no trembling, just a quiet steadiness that caught me off guard. I swallowed, not sure how to answer, but the truth had already been spilled across the screens and statements. Before I could speak, she knelt down so we were eye level, and a faint, almost knowing smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Don't worry," she said softly, like she was letting me in on a secret. "I handled it." I stared at her, trying to make sense of the words. In my mind, I told myself she was just trying to comfort me, trying to make a terrible moment a little lighter, the way people sometimes do when they don't know what else to say. But there was something in her eyes that didn't match the innocence of a simple reassurance. It was a sharpness, a quiet certainty, as though she knew far more than she was letting on. I wanted to ask her what she meant, press her until she explained, but the weight of the day had already worn me down, and my mind was too tangled to untie anything new. So instead, I let the words sit between us, strange and unsettling, not realizing in that moment that they weren't just words meant to soothe me, they were a promise. One I wouldn't fully understand until much later, when the pieces began to fall into place, and I saw just what she had done. Over the next few days, I began to notice small changes in her routine, the kind that might have slipped by me if I hadn't been so raw and alert from everything that had happened. She started spending long hours in her room, the door mostly closed, the soft hum of her laptop drifting into the hallway when I passed. At first, I thought she was distracting herself, maybe watching movies or talking to her friends, anything to keep her mind off the hole he had left in our lives. I didn't want to interfere, not when she seemed to be coping in her own way, but there was a focus to her I couldn't quite place. One night, I woke in the dark to get a glass of water, and as I passed her room, I heard it. Faint, quick typing, not the lazy rhythm of someone chatting or browsing, but fast, deliberate keystrokes like she was racing against a clock. I stopped, my hand resting against the wall, and noticed the thin stripe of light leaking from beneath her door. It wasn't just the glow of a movie playing, it was the steady white-blue light of a laptop screen, the kind that comes from working on something that needs all your attention. I thought about knocking, but I didn't. Something in me told me to wait. The pattern continued. Evenings spent behind a closed door. Mornings where she seemed both tired and sharper, like her mind had been somewhere far away during the night. Then one morning over breakfast, she looked up from her cereal, as casually as if she were asking about the weather, and said, "Do you remember Dad's old passwords?" She didn't explain why she was asking, didn't look up to gauge my reaction, just stirred her spoon slowly through the bowl, as if this was the most ordinary question in the world. For a moment, I froze, my mind stumbling over the suddenness of it. I thought about asking her what she needed them for, but something in the way she kept her eyes down told me she wasn't ready to share. And maybe, deep down, I wasn't ready to know. So I told her what I could remember, the old combinations he used when we first got our accounts, the phrases he was too stubborn to change because they were easy to remember. She nodded once, tucked the information away, and went back to eating as if nothing had happened. But from that moment, the suspicion began to grow in me like a quiet ember, small but persistent, and though I didn't know it yet, it was the start of a trail that would lead to a truth neither of us could have predicted. 2 days passed in a strange kind of quiet, the kind where the air feels heavy but you can't name why. I went about my days as best I could, keeping busy with small tasks, trying to put one foot in front of the other, even when my thoughts kept circling back to the emptiness in those accounts and the even greater emptiness he had left behind. Then, late in the afternoon, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number at first, but something about it made my stomach tighten. I answered, and before I could even say hello, his voice came through, sharp and frantic, cutting through the line like it was carrying every ounce of his anger straight into my kitchen. "What did you do?" he screamed, his words tumbling over each other in a rush. "You ruined everything. Do you hear me? Everything." There was no trace of guilt in his tone, no apology, just pure panic and rage, as if somehow he was the one who had been wronged. He went on, his voice rising and falling in angry bursts, but I stayed silent. I didn't ask him what he meant, didn't offer a single word in return. I simply let him run himself out, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached, my breath steady even as my heart pounded. Eventually, he seemed to realize I wasn't going to give him what he wanted, and with a final, furious exhale, he hung up. I stood there for a long moment, the quiet ringing in my ears louder than his shouting had been. I didn't know what he was talking about, but the way his voice had cracked told me something had happened, something he hadn't expected. Before I could set the phone down, I felt the weight of someone watching me. I turned toward the doorway, and there she was, leaning casually against the frame. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a spark in her eyes that made me think she knew exactly what that call had been about. She tilted her head just slightly, a faint smile touching her lips, and said, "Guess he saw the files." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through everything I thought I understood. Files. Not just bank statements or receipts, but something more. I wanted to ask her right then, demand to know what she had done. But I could see she wasn't ready to hand me the full truth. And maybe in that moment, I wasn't ready to hold it. All I knew was that whatever had happened on the other end of that phone call, it had shaken him. And for the first time since he'd left, the power no longer felt entirely in his hands. She didn't walk away after she said those words. She just stepped into the room and pulled out a chair, sitting down like we were about to have an ordinary conversation. But there was nothing ordinary about the way she was looking at me now. It was steady, calm. The kind of look that said she had been holding something in and had decided this was the moment to let it out. She leaned forward a little, resting her arms on the table, and in that same measured voice she said, his old laptop was still synced to the cloud. Everything he sent, everything he saved, every email, every attachment, it was all still there. He didn't even bother to unlink it. I could feel my pulse quickening as she spoke, each word pulling me deeper into a picture I hadn't dared to imagine. She told me how she had gone through the folders one by one, how she had followed the trail of bank transfers that led straight to the other woman. Money moving into accounts that were never meant to exist, amounts large enough to make your stomach turn. But that wasn't all. There were hidden investments under false names, records tucked away as if he'd been building a safety net for himself while we were planning our future together. And then there were the photos. Not just the kind that made you sick to your stomach, but the kind that could ruin a career, destroy a reputation, the images that no one involved would ever want to see the light of day. She didn't stop there. She explained how she had gathered it all, not sloppily, not in a rush, but carefully, methodically, making sure there were no gaps. She didn't just keep copies for herself. She sent them where they would matter most. To his boss, who now had a clear view of the kind of man they'd been trusting with company resources. To the IRS, with every questionable transaction laid out in a neat file. And to the mistress's own husband, who would now know exactly what had been going on behind his back. As she spoke, I felt a strange mix of emotions rising in me. Pride, shock, a trace of fear at just how calculated and unshaken she seemed through it all. She leaned back finally, her expression softening just enough to let me see the girl I had raised underneath the steel. "I didn't hurt him, Mom," she said quietly, almost gently. "I just let him hurt himself." And I realized then that while I had been drowning in the betrayal, she had been swimming straight toward the truth, ready to pull us both out of the water. It didn't take long for the ripple to turn into a wave. Within days, the woman he'd left with went quiet online. Her social media, once filled with snapshots of expensive dinners, beachside cocktails, and designer bags, was suddenly stripped down to almost nothing. The posts that used to flaunt their getaways disappeared one by one, as if she was trying to erase the proof of a life she no longer had. The comments from her friends, all the little hearts and fire emojis, stopped showing up. The sparkle she had been showing off so proudly had gone dull overnight. Then came the news from his side. His company, the one he had spent years boasting about, the one he said valued him so highly, had launched an internal investigation. I didn't know the details, but I knew enough to understand they had seen the files. The pay he had always counted on was suspended, while they dug through his accounts, his emails, and whatever else they could find. I imagined him trying to explain himself to people who no longer looked at him with respect, only suspicion. For a man like him, the shame of that alone would have been a wound. But it was only the beginning. The IRS moved faster than I thought they would. He got a formal notice about unreported income, the kind of letter that doesn't just go away with a phone call or a lawyer's smooth words. It meant paperwork, audits, questions he couldn't talk his way around. I knew the numbers they were about to uncover would tie directly back to the same accounts my daughter had exposed, the same ones he thought no one would ever trace. And in a small town, news like that doesn't stay hidden. People started whispering in the grocery store aisles, stopping mid-sentence when I passed by, not out of cruelty, but because they didn't know what to say. His name, once associated with charm and reliability, was now mentioned in low tones, a warning about what happens when you think you're too clever to be caught. Neighbors stopped asking where he was. They already knew enough to understand he wasn't coming back in the same way. His downfall wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic in the way movies show it. It was slow and undeniable, like watching a building collapse in stages, each piece crumbling till nothing was left but the dust of what he used to be. And through it all, I stayed quiet, letting the truth do the work I no longer had to. When I finally sat across from the lawyer, the stack of files my daughter had gathered resting between us, it felt like every piece of paper was carrying not just evidence, but pieces of my life I thought had been lost forever. I was bracing myself for disappointment, for some complicated legal language that would soften the blow of him telling me it was too late, that what was gone could never be retrieved. But instead he took his time, flipping through each page, reading carefully, his eyes narrowing at certain transactions, his lips pressing into a thin line at others. He wasn't rushing, and that alone told me something important. By the time he placed the final page back onto the stack, he looked at me with a steady expression and said, "This is airtight. With this evidence, recovery isn't just possible, it's likely." I didn't answer right away. My throat felt tight, and it took me a moment to realize why. I had been holding my breath without knowing it. Days of worry, of pacing the house, of wondering how I was going to rebuild from nothing, all started to loosen their grip. I let out a slow exhale, almost afraid that if I moved too fast, the hope I felt might vanish. But it didn't vanish. It stayed, small but steady, like the first light creeping over the horizon after a long night. And I realized that what I was feeling wasn't just relief over the possibility of getting the money back. It was the understanding that we weren't entirely powerless, that he hadn't taken everything. The lawyer explained what we needed to do next. There would be forms to sign, hearings to attend, and the process might stretch on longer than I wanted, but the foundation was already there. My daughter's meticulous work, the files, the timelines, the connections she had drawn between every transfer and account, had done more than give us a chance. It had given us a position of strength, the kind of position people rarely have after being blindsided in this way. When we opened the new account, the lawyer made sure it was protected in ways the old one never had been. Multiple safeguards, locked down so tightly no one could ever slip into it without our consent. Sitting beside my daughter at that desk, signing our names side by side, felt like stitching the first solid piece of our lives back together. This wasn't just an account for tuition and books. It was a declaration that what had been taken could be rebuilt, and that we would do it on our own terms. After we left the office, we didn't rush home. Instead, we walked slowly down the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows ahead of us. She slipped her hand into mine without saying a word, but that gesture said everything. I looked at her then, really looked at her, at the quiet strength in her posture, at the way she carried herself not like someone who had been a bystander in this mess, but like someone who had stood in the center of the storm and refused to be knocked down. She had saved more than her future. She had saved me from believing I was helpless, from falling into that deep and dangerous place where you convince yourself there's nothing left to fight for. She had reminded me that strength doesn't always come with noise or anger. Sometimes it works quietly, in the background, piecing together a plan before you even realize you need one. I thought about the nights I'd heard her typing behind her closed door. The mornings she had walked into the kitchen, like she was carrying something unspoken. I thought about the moment she asked for those old passwords, how I'd given them to her, without fully understanding why. And now I saw it clearly. While I had been drowning in the shock and pain of betrayal, she had already been working on the rescue. By the time we reached home, I knew something had shifted. This wasn't just about recovering what had been stolen. It was about taking back the control we'd been made to think we'd lost. It was about proving to ourselves that no matter what had been done to us, we could rebuild stronger. Whatever lay ahead, the hearings, the paperwork, the conversations I would rather not have, we would face it together. And no betrayal, no matter how deep, could undo the unshakable bond between us. That bond had been tested, and instead of breaking, it had turned to steel. Looking at her now, I realize that sometimes you don't have to raise your voice. You just raise your daughter, right? She stood in the space where I might have crumbled, and she turned what could have been the end into a beginning we built together. If someone ever tried to take from your child, tell me below. Or just write, "We handled it." That's enough. And if you're watching this alone, know that you're not invisible here. You're seen, and you belong. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next story.